Welcome to Muswell Hill Baptist Church. Today we're looking at the story of Abraham, but from a different part of the Bible, from the book of Isaiah. And in the later chapters of Isaiah, a time when the people of Israel were in exile, when they needed encouragement, when they felt abandoned by God, there are different occasions when Abraham's story is brought back into focus. And we're going to look at three of them today. The first is in Isaiah chapter 41.
Be silent before me, you islands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together at the place of judgment. Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed, by a path his feet have not travelled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last, I am he. The islands have seen it and fear. The ends of the earth tremble. They approach and come forward. They help each other and say to their companions, be strong. The metal worker encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes the anvil. One says of the welding, it is good. The other nails down the idol so that it will not topple. But you, O Lord, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, from its furthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and have not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be...
In these verses, God, through the prophet, makes clear to his people that they descend from his friend, Abraham. Now, if you don't know the Bible very well, or even if you know it fairly well, you may think that all over the Bible, God talks about his friends, his friend Noah, or his friend Job, or his friend Elijah. But that isn't the case. In fact, this is a unique passage in the Old Testament in which God calls a human being my friend. There is a reference to Abraham being the friend of God from Jehoshaphat when he says a prayer in the book of Chronicles. But only here through the mouth of the prophet does God actually describe Abraham as my friend. The question arises as to why God uses this very intimate phrase for his relationship with Abraham. He's often called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a way of showing that that's how things were set in motion when God singled out the family of Abraham as that family by which the earth would be blessed, from which his people would derive, and to which his people from all over the world would be linked. But my friend is exclusively used for Abraham, where the whole process begins. Was it because Abraham was a really, really good man? No. Abraham was a good man. But we have already seen in one of our videos, we'll show it at the end, that he faltered. And there were other passages in his story that we didn't look at, where he also repeats mistakes that he'd already made. So Abraham is not portrayed in the Bible as perfect. Why then is he my friend to God? The answer is two things. First of all, the depth and breadth of his faith. Now we know in the Bible that faith is what pleases God. God takes great pleasure in people who trust him, even where they cannot see. And there's no one in the Bible who is a better characterized person of faith than Abraham. He traveled from his home country, Ur of the Chaldees, to a place called Haran. He traveled then, leaving the rest of his wider family behind in Haran, into the unknown promised land of Canaan, where he knew nobody. And he did all this on the say-so of God. This was great faith. And then in the promised land, of course, he is given this amazing promise that he will have a child in his very old age who will be the son of promise through which God will bless the nations. And he had to exercise great faith to believe in that promise. And then God tested him in Genesis chapter 22. You can see the video about that, the son and the lamb. We'll highlight that at the end as well. When God tested him so that he almost, as it were, had to give Isaac back to God in death, but not quite. But he trusted God enough to trust God with his son's life. So these huge moments of faith meant that Abraham was pleasing to God, not because he was a good man, so much as because he was a man who trusted God deeply. And right through his life, right through to the end, even when Sarah had died as a widower, he was still exercising trust in God. The other thing he did was he loved God. We know that because when he first arrives in this unknown land where there is nowhere to worship the true God, he set up stones here, there, and frankly, everywhere he went. He made a place of worship where there was no place of worship. Now, some of us struggle to get to a place of worship when they're dotted on every other street corner in our towns and cities in the UK, when they're all over online. But for Abraham, he had to create his place of worship from scratch. But he still did it because he loved God. And perhaps that's the essence of friendship, isn't it? That a friend is someone who we take pleasure in. We may show love to people who, frankly, as the Bible describes we should, are our enemies, though we also love our friends. But friendship is an amazing thing. It's something where two people take pleasure in each other. And perhaps that's the real secret of Abraham's friendship with God. Not just that he had faith, but that he wanted to be God's friend. And he longed for God in an empty and desert land. In the New Testament, there is a reference that encourages us to realize that this close, intimate relationship with God, although in a way exclusive to Abraham in times past, is reflected in the relationship that God has with us in Jesus. In John chapter 15, Jesus says this to his disciples: "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master's business is. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you." So our relationship with God reflects that kind of pleasure and depth of relationship that Abraham had if we trust in Jesus. And you can compare this with Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 7. "The metal worker encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes with the anvil. One says of the welding, 'It is good.' The other nails down the idol so that it will not topple." In this graphic description, God, through the prophet Isaiah, is making a huge point, isn't he? That the gods of the nations are fabrications, literally fabrications, made by human beings. Gods so lacking in power that they must be nailed down so they don't fall over. Whereas Abraham had a God who was his friend, and a God who counted him as a friend. Relationship is so important in true faith. Religion is not about things. It's about a relationship with God. And can I encourage you that if until now you have believed that relationship with God is about things, rituals, buildings, idols, it's about having as a friend the maker of the universe and being his servants and his children. Now, when we move on to Isaiah chapter 51, Abraham appears again. "Look to the rock from which you were cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who gave you birth. When I called him, he was only one man, and I blessed him and made him many." Abraham was to the people in exile their father. He was where their relationship with God had begun back in history. And they are to remember Abraham. That's why his story is accounted for us in the scriptures. Because Abraham is the sign that from one person so many blessings can flow if that person is a person of faith. And that has never changed. It's found elsewhere in the Bible and very many times elsewhere. But Abraham remains the supreme example of it in the Old Testament. And from that one man of faith comes every person of faith in the people of God. We are all, if you like, children of Abraham. He blazed the way. And in this glorious passage, the prophet encourages the discouraged people. And maybe after a pandemic or in a pandemic, we feel discouraged. But we should not be discouraged, because our God is the God who turned the one man in the desert, Abraham, into the father of countless people of faith. So in chapter 41, we see the depth of that friendship relationship with God. In chapter 51, we see the prospects of that relationship and how that relationship can bring tremendous, untold blessing across the whole world. And in our lives, we do not know the impact our lives will have. But if we believe, they will certainly have a positive impact in the lives of many others. We come to our third reading in the later chapters of Isaiah, and we find this in chapter 63. And here we see that Abraham, wonderful though he was and remains in our story, is also in some respects useless. Here the people are imagined praying to God. Verse 15, "Look down from heaven and see. From your lofty throne, holy and glorious, where are your zeal and your might? Your tenderness and compassion are withheld from us. But you are our Father. Though Abraham does not know us, or Jacob acknowledge us, you, Lord, are our Father. Our Redeemer from of old is your name." So here we see the people in their desperation are figuring out, where do we go for help? Can we go to the fatherhood of Abraham? No, because Abraham doesn't know who we are. Abraham doesn't know who I am. Abraham doesn't know who you are. We cannot go to Abraham and to the saints. We have to go to our Father who is in heaven. Jesus says, when you pray, pray our Father. And these people of old, struggling as they were in a far-off land, worried that they had been forgotten by God, they realized that Abraham can't hear them, nor could Jacob or Israel, his grandson. No, they are going to need to go direct to the living God, who is our true Father. And that's the thing, you see. Abraham is a great example, an inspiration to us in faith. But we must know God for ourselves. We must turn to God ourselves. We must be like Abraham and not have him simply as our hero. And it's true, isn't it, that many of us have great heroes in life. Heroes in the wider world and heroes in the deepest world of spiritual things. People who we aspire to be like and wish we could emulate in some way. But at its heart in our lives, we need to lay the heroes aside, for they do not know us. We need to speak to God, who does know us, our Father, who art in heaven. And may God grant to me and to you a faith something like Abraham's, a faith in Jesus, and a faith in a heavenly Father who can make all the difference to our lives, both in this world and in worlds to come.